Cold weather nearly emptied Mara's woodshed, so desperation drove her crowbar through an old smokehouse wall, hoping dry boards might last until morning. One rotten plank snapped loose. Behind it stood something impossible, another narrow door, hidden inside timber for decades. She froze, staring at iron hinges buried beneath soot and dust. Nobody mentioned this opening, not even grandfather. Firewood suddenly mattered less. Whatever waited beyond that frame had been sealed away on purpose. Tell us where you're watching from today. Subscribe to this channel and stay close, because forgotten farms sometimes guard secrets powerful enough to change everything a struggling woman believed possible. Possibility felt distant when Mara wrapped her fingers around the little iron latch. It fought her at first, stiff with rust, until one hard pull sent the hidden door groaning inward. A breath of cold, stale air rolled across her face. She lifted the lantern higher and saw a room no wider than a pantry, sealed between the smokehouse wall and the stone foundation. Dust covered everything. Old shelves leaned beneath glass jars, tin boxes, and bundles of yellowed paper tied with string. A handsaw hung beside two skinning knives. Wooden crates sat stacked in the far corner, each marked with faded pencil numbers she couldn't read from the doorway. Mara stepped inside carefully. "Grandpa, what were you hiding back here?" she whispered. No answer came, only the soft creak of boards under her boots. The first crate held nothing dramatic, just rusted hooks, butcher twine, and a heavy sharpening stone. The second contained small hand tools wrapped in oilcloth. Useful ones, perhaps, but hardly worth building a secret room for. Then she noticed the shelf behind them. A thick leather ledger rested beneath a layer of dust, its cover cracked but dry. Mara carried it toward the lantern and opened the first page. Columns of names filled the paper beside dates, weights, and dollar amounts. Some entries went back nearly 70 years. At first she assumed they were meat sales. Then the descriptions stopped making sense. Beans, corn, rye, sorghum, apple stock, red wheat. Beside several entries, someone had written the same short note. "Kept below." Mara frowned. Below what? She turned another page and found a hand-drawn sketch of the smokehouse. The outer walls were there, so was the hidden room. Beneath both, however, someone had drawn a narrow rectangle surrounded by stone, with a small X placed near the back corner. Her pulse quickened. She lowered the book and looked at the floor. Most boards were dark with age, but one section near the rear wall looked different. 4 planks were shorter than the others, their ends resting neatly against a removable wooden strip. That was when she understood the hidden door wasn't the real secret. It was only the entrance. Mara knelt, brushed decades of dirt from the nearest plank, and slipped the crowbar beneath its edge. Something hollow answered beneath her, a quiet knock from under the floor. The hollow knock made Mara pull her hand back. She stayed kneeling beside the loose board, listening as if something underneath might answer again. Nothing did. She set the lantern closer, wedged the crowbar deeper, and pushed down. The old plank lifted with a dry crack. Beneath it sat darkness, then the stone. She pulled up a second board, then a third, until a square opening appeared in the floor, barely wide enough for one person to climb through. A short ladder disappeared into the black space below. Mara grabbed the ledger and checked the sketch again. The little X matched this exact corner. Before she climbed down, she noticed several pages near the back had been folded together. She opened them carefully and found notes, written in a different hand, likely her grandfather's. 3 short instructions filled the page. "Keep the good seed dry. Trade only what we can spare. Save enough for spring." Those lines changed everything. This wasn't just a place for storing meat. The smokehouse had once been part pantry, part seed bank, and part emergency supply room for families scattered across the county. If you enjoy stories about forgotten farms old skills, and the secrets people leave behind. Subscribe now, because what Mara found next explained why somebody had hidden this room so carefully. She lowered herself onto the ladder. Cold air rose around her boots. At the bottom, her lantern revealed a shallow stone chamber with shelves built directly into the walls. Metal tins sat in rows. Cloth sacks had collapsed into dusty heaps. Several glass jars still held dried beans, corn kernels, and wheat. One shelf carried dozens of paper envelopes. Each had a handwritten name. The labels read: red flint corn, turkey wheat, brown Crowder peas, and golden sorghum. Mara knew enough about farming to recognize some names, but others meant nothing to her. Then she spotted a date: 1958. A second envelope read 1949. Another went back to 1937. Her hands started trembling. She returned to the ledger and followed the matching entries. Beside each crop name were notes about which family had grown it, who borrowed seed, what survived drought, and which fields produced best after hard winters. This wasn't a collection, it was a record of survival. Near the final page, one sentence had been underlined twice: "Never let these disappear." Mara looked around the chamber again. For the first time, she realized the old smokehouse had been guarding something still alive. The chamber suddenly no longer felt dead. Those envelopes were more than paper, and those jars were more than old food. Each one held a chance that some forgotten crop might still return to the soil. She climbed back into the smokehouse with the ledger tucked under her arm and carried 3 sealed tins into daylight. By noon, she had called Walter Keene, a retired farmer who lived 2 miles down the road and remembered nearly every family that had worked land in the county. Walter arrived before supper. He turned one tin slowly in his hands, then stared at the faded label. "I haven't seen that name since I was a boy," he said. Mara opened the ledger to the matching page. Walter read quietly for several minutes. His expression changed. According to the notes, families had used the hidden chamber whenever bad weather cut roads, crops failed, or money ran short. They stored dry food there, but seed mattered most. After a poor harvest, someone could borrow enough grain or beans to plant again, then return in part of the next crop. Nobody called it a bank. That was exactly what it was. Walter followed Mara beneath the floor and pointed toward the stone walls. Thick earth kept the room cooler during summer, while the raised shelves protected supplies from damp ground. Small vents near the ceiling moved air without letting much light inside. Simple ideas. Smart ones. Back upstairs, Mara studied the envelopes again. Most were brittle, and several had already split. She wanted to know whether anything inside could still grow, but Walter warned her not to rush. "Old seed can surprise you," he said, "but you only get one chance with some of it." They sorted the strongest containers onto a clean table and copied every label into a notebook. Mara resisted opening the rarest packets. Instead, they chose a few beans and kernels from tins, holding larger amounts. The next morning, Walter showed her how to place them between damp cloths near the kitchen window. Days passed. Nothing happened. By the 5th morning, Mara almost stopped checking. Then she unfolded one cloth and froze. A tiny white root had pushed through the shell of a bean. Walter leaned closer and smiled. Mara looked toward the ruined smokehouse outside. The building she had planned to burn was giving something back. From ruin came a gift Mara could barely believe. She carried the sprouted bean to the kitchen table like it might break under its own weight. Walter laughed softly when he saw her face, but even he kept staring. "One seed doesn't prove much," he said. "Still, it proves enough to try." Over the next week, they tested small samples from several larger tins. Most stayed lifeless. A few softened, split, then failed. But 3 varieties pushed out healthy roots. The strongest came from an envelope marked Red Flint Corn. Walter knew the name. His father had grown it on poor ground where newer corn sometimes struggled. The stalks were shorter, the ears hard, and the kernels dried well for meal. Nobody nearby planted it anymore. That changed Mara's plan. Instead of selling the tins to collectors, she cleared a narrow patch beside the smokehouse. Walter helped her plant every living kernel they could spare, spacing each one carefully so nothing was wasted. Weeks passed. Green shoots appeared. By early summer, the little plot stood higher than her knees. Beans climbed rough poles beside the fence. Sorghum formed thick stems along the edge. The corn darkened into deep red and gold as the season turned. Word spread. Neighbors started stopping by. Some came because they were curious. Others brought old stories from parents and grandparents who remembered the same crop names written in Mara's ledger. One man recognized a bean his mother had cooked every winter. A woman in her 70s cried when she saw the corn. "My dad used to grind that," she whispered. That moment hit Mara harder than any price tag could. The real treasure wasn't antique tools, hidden money, or some forgotten stash waiting behind a wall. It was a chain that had nearly broken. It passed from seed to soil, family to family, season to season. Mara began saving the healthiest new seed, labeling each packet with the original name and the year it returned. Walter showed her how to dry it properly, while neighbors offered garden space for future trials. By harvest, the smokehouse had stopped looking like firewood. It had become the center of something growing again. And when Mara opened the old ledger that evening, she added one new line beneath her grandfather's warning. They didn't disappear. As long as somebody cared enough to plant them, the story beneath floorboards would keep living on. Keeping that promise became Mara's next purpose. She repaired the smokehouse roof first, then replaced only the boards too rotten to save. The hidden door stayed where she found it. Walter helped brace the floor above the stone chamber, while 2 neighbors brought scrap lumber, hinges, and an old workbench that fit perfectly against the back wall. Nobody laughed at the building anymore. People asked questions instead. By late summer, Mara had jars lined across clean shelves, each one marked with the crop name, harvest date, and field where it had grown. The healthiest seeds went into separate tins underground, away from heat and damp air. She kept careful notes in a new ledger beside the old one. The first harvest was small. That didn't matter. Those few ears of corn, handfuls of beans, and bundles of sorghum gave them enough seed to plant larger test rows the following spring. Walter stood beside the field one evening and shook his head. "Your granddad would have liked this," he said. Mara smiled. "He probably would have told me not to tear the wall apart in the first place." Walter laughed. "Sometimes you've got to break the wrong thing to find the right one." By the next season, 3 nearby farms agreed to grow small patches. Each farmer promised to return part of the harvest so the supply could keep growing. Nobody paid for the seed. Nobody claimed ownership. They shared it. That was how the old system had worked, and Mara saw no reason to change it. Soon, school children visited the farm to see the hidden chamber. Older neighbors brought handwritten recipes, faded photographs, and names of crops they remembered from childhood. One family even found an old envelope in a barn drawer that matched an entry in the ledger. The smokehouse became more useful than it had been in decades, not as a museum, but as a working place. Every season added new pages to Mara's notebook. Some crops failed. Others surprised everyone. One bean handled dry weather better than modern garden types. A sorghum line produced well on a patch of poor soil where almost nothing else had thrived. Months earlier, Mara had seen only cold nights and firewood. Now she saw shelves, seeds, neighbors, and another spring waiting ahead. The hidden door had opened more than a room. It had reopened a way of helping people survive together. Together, those forgotten seeds gave Mara more than a harvest. They gave an old farm purpose again and reminded an entire community that useful things can hide behind what looks worthless. Subscribe for more rural stories about hard choices, hidden value, and the people who refuse to give up.